Hello everyone, I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. On a warm summer day in July 2015, the mountains of Idaho promised adventure and memories for a young family eager to escape the routines of everyday life. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and the distant sound of a creek bubbling over smooth stones. It was the kind of place where parents brought their children to teach them about nature, to show them the beauty of the wilderness, to create moments that would last a lifetime. For 2-year-old Duor Kunz Jr., this camping trip to Timber Creek Campground was supposed to be exactly that, a magical experience in the great outdoors, surrounded by family who loved him. His parents, Jessica Mitchell and Duor Kunz Sr., had planned this trip with care, inviting Duor's great-grandfather, Robert Walton, and Robert's friend, Isaac Rainwind, to join them. It was meant to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to bond, to fish, to sit around a campfire and watch the stars emerge in the vast Idaho sky. Duor Jr. was a bright-eyed little boy hair, and an infectious smile that could light up any room. At just 2 years old, he was at that wonderful age where everything was new and exciting, where the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. His parents adored him. Jessica, his mother, was 25 years old, a young woman who loved her son with every fiber of her being. She had dreams of watching him grow up, of seeing him start school, make friends, maybe play sports or learn an instrument. She imagined his graduations, his first job, perhaps one day a family of his own. His father was equally devoted. At 27, he worked hard to provide for his small family and looked forward to teaching his son all the things a father teaches: how to fish, how to camp, how to be a good man. This camping trip was supposed to be the beginning of many such adventures, a tradition they could continue as Duor grew older. The Timber Creek Campground sits in the remote wilderness of Lemhi County, Idaho, surrounded by the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. It's a beautiful but isolated area, the kind of place where cell phone service is spotty at best and the nearest town is miles away. The campground itself is rustic, with basic facilities and campsites scattered among the trees along the edge of a reservoir. In July, it's a popular spot for families and outdoor enthusiasts. But it's also a place where nature remains largely untamed. The forest is dense, the terrain rugged, and the wilderness stretches for miles in every direction. For experienced campers, it's a paradise. For a toddler, it presents countless hidden dangers. On the morning of July 10, 2015, everything seemed perfect. The family had arrived at the campground the previous afternoon, setting up their camp and settling in. Great-grandfather Robert Walton, who was 74 years old and not in the best of health, stayed close to the camp, resting in a chair and enjoying the fresh mountain air. Isaac Rainwind, a friend of the family who had agreed to help look after Robert during the trip, busied himself with small tasks around the campsite. Duor Jr. played nearby, his laughter echoing through the trees as he explored the immediate area around the tents and vehicles. Jessica and Duor Sr. watched him carefully, aware that even in the relatively open space of the campground, a small child could quickly get into trouble. The family had planned to explore a bit that morning. Duor Sr. wanted to check out a nearby creek, perhaps do some fishing, and Jessica was happy to go along. They intended to take Duor Jr. with them, of course, but as they prepared to leave, they made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They decided to leave the toddler at the campsite with his great-grandfather and Isaac. It seemed like a reasonable choice at the time. They wouldn't be gone long, maybe 20 or 30 minutes at most. Great-grandfather Walton would keep an eye on the boy, and Isaac was there as well. The campsite felt safe, enclosed by the familiar boundaries of their tents and vehicles. What could possibly go wrong in such a short time? Jessica and Duor Sr. set off down the trail toward the creek, leaving their son behind. According to their later accounts, they spent about 15 to 20 minutes exploring the area, walking along the water's edge, and discussing whether it would be a good spot to bring Duor Jr. for some wading later in the day. The creek was shallow and clear, perfect for a toddler to splash around in under close supervision. They felt good about the trip, about the memories they were creating, about the quality time they were spending as a family in this beautiful place. Everything seemed right with the world. But when they returned to the campsite, their world shattered in an instant. Dior Jr. was gone. The little boy with the blonde hair and the bright smile was nowhere to be seen. Jessica's heart seized in her chest as she called his name, her voice rising in panic. Dior Sr. joined in, shouting for his son, searching frantically around the immediate area. They asked Robert Walton where the boy was, and the elderly man, confused and hard of hearing, couldn't give them a clear answer. He had been dozing in his chair, he said, and assumed the boy was with his parents. Isaac Rainwind, when questioned, seemed equally uncertain. He had been doing something else, hadn't been watching the child, thought someone else was responsible. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. No one had been watching Dior Jr. In the 15 or 20 minutes his parents had been away, in the brief time when everyone assumed someone else was keeping an eye on him, the 2-year-old had vanished. Jessica began to scream. Running through the campsite, checking inside the tent, behind the vehicles, in every possible hiding spot. Dior Sr. sprinted into the surrounding forest, calling his son's name over and over, his voice growing hoarse with desperation. But there was no response, no sound of a little boy crying or calling for his parents, no sign of where he might have gone. At approximately 2:26 in the afternoon on July 10, 2015, Dior Kun Sr. made the call that would set in motion one of the most extensive and baffling search operations in Idaho history. He dialed 9911, his voice shaking with fear and barely controlled panic, and reported that his 2-year-old son was missing from their campsite at Timber Creek Campground. The dispatcher, trained to remain calm in emergencies, asked the standard questions. When was the child last seen? What was he wearing? Did he have any medical conditions? Dior Sr. tried to answer clearly, describing his son's appearance, the little cowboy boots he had been wearing, the clothing that might help searchers identify him. But his mind was reeling, struggling to process the impossible reality that his son had simply disappeared. The response was swift. Lemhi County Sheriff's Office dispatched deputies to the scene immediately, and within hours, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. Search and rescue teams from multiple agencies converged on the remote campground, bringing with them trained dogs, aerial support, and every piece of equipment that might help locate a missing toddler in the vast wilderness. The Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue Unit deployed their most experienced personnel. Volunteers from surrounding communities drove for hours to join the search. Everyone understood the urgency. A 2-year-old child alone in the Idaho wilderness faced terrifying dangers. The nights were cold, even in July, with temperatures dropping into the 40s. The terrain was treacherous, full of steep drop-offs, dense vegetation, and fast-moving water. Wild animals, including bears and mountain lions, roamed the area. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding Dior Jr. alive and well. The search teams worked with methodical intensity, dividing the area into grids and systematically covering every inch of ground. They searched on foot, on horseback, and from the air using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. They waded through the creek, checked under fallen logs, looked into every crevice and hollow where a small child might have crawled or fallen. The search dogs, trained to track human scent, were deployed multiple times, following trails that led in different directions but ultimately went nowhere conclusive. Some dogs indicated interest in areas near the creek. Others seemed to pick up a scent leading away from the campground into the dense forest, but none of the leads resulted in finding the missing boy. As the hours turned into days, the search expanded. More volunteers arrived, some traveling from other states to help. The campground became a base of operations, filled with emergency vehicles, command tents, and exhausted searchers grabbing brief moments of rest before heading back out. Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kun Sr. were beside themselves with grief and fear, clinging to each other and to the hope that their son would be found safe. They gave interview after interview to the media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward, begging the public to help bring their baby home. Great-grandfather Robert Walton and Isaac Greenwood were also questioned repeatedly, though their advanced age and health issues in Robert's case, and general demeanor in Isaac's case, initially raised no particular suspicions. The media coverage was intense. News of the missing toddler spread rapidly across Idaho and then nationally. Dior Jr.'s face appeared on television screens, in newspapers, and all over social media. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: an innocent child, a remote wilderness setting, and the agonizing mystery of how a 2-year-old could vanish without a trace in just a matter of minutes. Tips began pouring in from across the country, some credible, many not. Every lead was investigated, every reported sighting checked, but none brought searchers any closer to finding Dior Jr. On the ground, the search teams faced increasing frustration. Despite their best efforts, despite the hundreds of hours of searching and the thousands of acres covered, they found nothing: no clothing, no footprints, no physical evidence that Dior Jr. had wandered into the wilderness. It was as if the little boy had simply evaporated into thin air. Search and rescue experts began to express their bewilderment. In cases where a small child wanders away from a campsite, there are usually signs: disturbed vegetation, small footprints, items dropped along the way. Children Dior's age typically don't travel far, often less than a mile or two, and they usually seek shelter under bushes or in enclosed spaces when they get tired or scared. But in this case, there was nothing. The absence of evidence was itself deeply troubling. As the search entered its second week, the initial frantic energy began to give way to a grim determination. The likelihood of finding Dior Jr. alive diminished with each passing day, but the searchers refused to give up. They continued to comb the wilderness, now looking not just for a living child, but for any trace of what might have happened to him. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise. They began to look more carefully at the circumstances of the disappearance, at the timeline of events, at the statements given by the 4 adults who had been at the campsite. It was during this phase of the investigation that the first cracks began to appear in the family's account of what had happened. The more investigators looked at the details, the more questions arose. The timeline didn't quite make sense. The explanations for who was watching Dior Jr. and when didn't align. Small inconsistencies in the statements given by Jessica and Dior Sr. began to accumulate. Nothing dramatic at first, just minor discrepancies that might be attributed to the stress and confusion of the situation. But as investigators pressed for more details, as they conducted multiple interviews and compared the various accounts, the inconsistencies grew more pronounced. Dior Sr. and Jessica Mitchell insisted they had only been gone for 15 to 20 minutes. But when investigators walked the route they claimed to have taken to the creek and back, it seemed like it should have taken longer. The parents said they had left Dior Jr. in the care of his great-grandfather, but Robert Walton maintained he had been asleep and wasn't aware the child had been left with him. Isaac Greenwood's account was vague and uncertain, offering little clarity about what had actually transpired during those crucial minutes. The more investigators tried to piece together what had happened, the more the story seemed to shift and change. Still, at this stage, the focus remained on finding Dior Jr. The possibility that the adults might be hiding something, or that the disappearance might not be what it seemed was not yet the primary concern. The massive search effort continued, with teams returning again and again to the campground and the surrounding wilderness. Divers searched the reservoir, though it seemed unlikely a toddler could have made it that far on his own. Aerial searches continued, covering miles of rugged terrain. Ground teams pushed deeper into the forest, searching areas that seemed beyond the range a 2-year-old could travel. Just in case some unusual circumstance had carried the child farther than expected. Throughout all of this, Jessica and Dior Sr. remained in the public eye, giving interviews and making emotional pleas. Jessica, in particular, seemed devastated, her face etched with the kind of grief only a mother who has lost a child can know. She spoke of her son in the present tense, refusing to give up hope, describing his personality, his favorite toys, the little things that made him special. Dior Sr., more reserved but equally anguished, echoed her pleas. asking anyone who might have seen anything to please come forward. To the public, they appeared to be grieving parents desperate to find their missing child. But behind the scenes, investigators were growing increasingly skeptical. The lack of any physical evidence in the wilderness was unprecedented. In similar cases, even when a child's body isn't immediately found, there are usually some traces. A piece of clothing snagged on a branch, small footprints in soft soil, a disturbance in the vegetation where a child passed through. The search dog should have been able to pick up a stronger scent trail if Dior Jr. had wandered into the forest on his own. The absence of all such evidence suggested to some investigators that perhaps the child had never entered the wilderness at all. Perhaps something had happened at the campsite itself, and the story of the wandering toddler was a cover for something more sinister. As these suspicions grew, the investigation began to shift. While search and rescue operations continued, law enforcement also started to focus more intensively on the 4 adults who had been present when Dior Jr. disappeared. They conducted polygraph examinations, brought in additional interrogation specialists, and began to look into the backgrounds and histories of Jessica Mitchell, Dior Kun Sr., Robert Walton, and Isaac Rainwand. What they found would begin to paint a very different picture of what might have happened on that July day in the Idaho wilderness. The polygraph results were deeply troubling. Both Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kun Sr. were asked to take polygraph examinations, a standard procedure in cases of missing children. According to the investigators, both failed their polygraphs, showing deception when answering key questions about their son's disappearance. Law enforcement sources later stated that the results were not inconclusive or ambiguous but clear failures, indicating that both parents were being dishonest about critical aspects of the case. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation and the public following the case. When confronted with the polygraph results, both Jessica and Dior Sr. offered explanations. They claimed the stress of the situation, the trauma of losing their child, and the pressure of the interrogation process had affected their responses. They maintained their innocence, insisting they had nothing to do with their son's disappearance and that they had told investigators the truth. But the failed polygraphs, combined with the inconsistencies in their statements, caused investigators to view them with increasing suspicion. The possibility that these were not grieving parents, but rather individuals with something to hide, moved to the forefront of the investigation. The focus then turned to Isaac Rainwand and Robert Walton as well. Isaac, who had been described as a friend helping to care for the elderly grandfather, also agreed to a polygraph examination. The results of his test were reportedly inconclusive, neither clearly indicating truth nor deception. His statements about the day of the disappearance remained vague and unhelpful, offering little useful information. Some investigators wondered if Isaac's cognitive limitations, which became more apparent as they spoke with him, might make him an unreliable witness, while others questioned whether he knew more than he was saying. Robert Walton, the great-grandfather, was in poor health, and his advanced age and medical conditions made him a less viable subject for intensive questioning. He maintained that he had been asleep or not fully aware of what was happening around him during the critical time period. Investigators found no particular reason to suspect him of direct involvement in any harm to the child, but his inability to provide a clear account of events left yet another gap in the timeline of that day. As law enforcement continued to press Jessica and Dior Sr., their stories began to evolve and change. Details that had been stated with certainty in early interviews became less clear in later ones. The timeline of their movements shifted. Their explanations for why they had left Dior Jr. at the campsite varied in different tellings. These changes could potentially be explained by the normal confusion and memory distortion that occurs in traumatic situations, but to experienced investigators, the pattern suggested something more deliberate, an attempt to craft a narrative that would explain the child's disappearance, without revealing what had actually happened. One particularly troubling development came when investigators began to dig into the family's activities in the days and hours before arriving at the campground. They discovered that Dior Sr. and Jessica had stopped at a convenience store in Leadore, Idaho, a small town near the campground, shortly before heading up to Timber Creek. Security camera footage from the store showed the couple entering and making a purchase, but notably, Dior Jr. was not visible in the footage. This raised an immediate and alarming question. Where was the child during that stop? If he was in the vehicle, why wasn't he brought into the store? And if he wasn't in the vehicle, where was he? When confronted with this discrepancy, the parents initially seemed confused, then offered various explanations. They said the child must have been sleeping in the car, or perhaps one of them had stayed outside with him. Or maybe he had been with the great-grandfather in another vehicle. But the investigators found these explanations unsatisfying and inconsistent with other aspects of their story. The store footage became a critical piece of evidence, suggesting that something might have been wrong even before the family arrived at the campground, that Dior Jr. might have been in some kind of distress or possibly already deceased before the camping trip even began. This theory, horrific as it was, began to gain traction among investigators. Perhaps they theorized something had happened to Dior Jr. before the family left for the camping trip, or during the drive to the campground. Perhaps the entire camping trip was staged to provide a plausible explanation for the child's disappearance, a way to make it look like a tragic accident rather than something more sinister. The remote wilderness location would be the perfect place to dispose of a body, and the chaos of a search and rescue operation would trample any evidence that might have existed at the campsite. It was a dark theory, one that painted the parents not as victims, but as perpetrators of an unthinkable crime. The investigation took another turn when cadaver dogs were brought to the campsite. These specially trained canines can detect the scent of human remains, even when a body has been moved or is no longer present. When the cadaver dogs were deployed at the Timber Creek campground, they showed interest in several areas, including around the vehicles that had belonged to the family. The dogs' alerts suggested that a deceased person had been present in or near those vehicles at some point. This was not definitive proof. Cadaver dogs can occasionally give false positives, and the alerts don't indicate when a body was present, only that the scent of human decomposition exists in the area. But combined with the other evidence, it was another piece of a very troubling puzzle. Investigators also began to look more closely at Jessica Mitchell's and Dior Sr.'s backgrounds and their relationship. They discovered that the couple had a tumultuous history, marked by financial stress, arguments, and instability. While this didn't prove they had harmed their child, it did provide a potential context for understanding how something terrible might have happened. Was there an accident that they panicked and tried to cover up? Was there abuse that escalated to a fatal incident? Or was there something even more calculated and cold-blooded? Without Dior Jr.'s body and without a confession, investigators could only theorize. The public, which had initially rallied around the family with sympathy and support, began to turn as these new details emerged. Online forums and social media lit up with speculation and accusations. Some people remained convinced that Dior Jr. had simply wandered off and met with some tragic accident in the wilderness, his body yet to be found in the vast and rugged terrain. But many others, following the twists and turns of the investigation, became convinced that the parents were guilty of something, whether intentional harm, negligent manslaughter, or an elaborate cover-up. The case became a source of national fascination and debate, with armchair detectives dissecting every detail and proposing countless theories. The Lemhi County Sheriff at the time, Lynn Bowerman, and the lead investigator on the case, made several public statements as the investigation progressed. In December of 2015, several months after Dior Jr.'s disappearance, Sheriff Bowerman announced that investigators believed the four adults who were at the campground, Jessica Mitchell, Dior Sr., Isaac Rainwind, and Robert Walton, knew more about the child's disappearance than they were saying. This was a significant escalation, a public declaration that law enforcement no longer viewed this simply as a case of a lost child, but as something potentially criminal. In early 2016, the case took an even more dramatic turn when the new Lemhi County Sheriff, Steve Penner, and the county prosecutor held a press conference to announce that Dior Jr. was no longer simply a missing child, but was believed to be the victim of a crime. They stopped short of naming specific suspects or detailing exactly what they believed had happened, but the implication was clear. Investigators believed the child was dead, and they believed someone at that campsite was responsible. The search efforts, which had already scaled back significantly, were effectively ended. The focus now was entirely on building a criminal case. Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. were named as suspects. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. The parents of a missing toddler, who had tearfully pleaded for help finding their son, were now being publicly labeled as suspects in his death. Both vehemently denied the accusations, continuing to maintain their innocence and insisting they had nothing to do with their son's disappearance. They claimed they were being railroaded by investigators who couldn't solve the case and needed someone to blame. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of a body, and what they characterized as a rush to judgment. Their attorneys fought back against the allegations, arguing that the case against them was entirely circumstantial. There was no body, no crime scene, no forensic evidence linking them to any harm against their child. The failed polygraphs, the inconsistent statements, the troubling timeline, all of these could be explained by the trauma and stress of the situation, they argued. Without concrete proof of a crime, how could the state claim that one had occurred? It was a strong legal argument, and it highlighted the central problem facing prosecutors. How do you charge someone with a crime when you can't prove the victim is even dead, let alone show how they died? The case entered a prolonged legal and investigative stalemate. Despite their belief that Jessica and Dior Sr. were responsible for their son's death, investigators couldn't gather enough evidence to file charges. Grand juries were convened to hear evidence and potentially issue indictments, but no charges materialized. The case remained open, technically still an active investigation, but with little apparent progress. Years passed, and Dior Jr. remained missing, his fate unknown, his body never found despite extensive searches. His parents remained free under a cloud of suspicion, but never formally charged with any crime related to his disappearance. The lack of resolution was agonizing for everyone involved. Dior Jr.'s extended family members, who had not been at the campground that day, were left in a state of perpetual grief and uncertainty. Some believed Jessica and Dior Sr. were innocent, and that their grandson or nephew had simply vanished in a tragic accident. Others were convinced of their guilt and felt betrayed and horrified that people they had trusted could have harmed a child. The community in Idaho where the family had lived was similarly divided, with heated arguments breaking out over what really happened to the little boy with the blonde hair and the bright smile. For the investigators, the case became an obsession and a source of deep frustration. They felt certain they knew what had happened, or at least that they knew the parents were lying about something crucial. But knowing and proving are two very different things in the American justice system. Without a body, without a confession, without some piece of physical evidence that definitively showed a crime had occurred, their hands were tied. They continued to review the evidence, to re-interview witnesses, to hope that some new piece of information would break the case open. But as more time passed, the likelihood of such a breakthrough diminished. The theories about what actually happened to Dior Kunz Jr. are numerous and varied. One theory holds that Dior died accidentally before the camping trip, perhaps from a fall, an illness that went untreated, or some other mishap. Panicking and fearing they would be blamed or lose custody of any future children, Jessica and Dior Sr. allegedly decided to hide the death and make it look like the child had disappeared during a camping trip. They brought the body to the remote campground, disposed of it somewhere in the vast wilderness where it would never be found, and then staged the frantic search for a lost child. Another theory suggests that something happened at the campground itself, perhaps an accident that occurred while the parents were actually present, but that they tried to cover up. Maybe Dior Jr. fell and hit his head, or drowned in the creek, or suffered some other fatal injury, and rather than reporting it immediately, the parents panicked and tried to make it look like he had wandered off. In this scenario, they might have hidden the body nearby during the initial confusion, and then moved it later when searchers were focused elsewhere. A darker theory posits that Dior Jr.'s death was not accidental at all but the result of abuse or neglect. Some have speculated that the child was being mistreated, that an incident of abuse went too far, and that the camping trip was a premeditated plan to dispose of the body and avoid consequences. This theory is supported by some who point to alleged signs of stress in the family's life, financial problems, and relationship issues that might create a context for such a horrific act. However, there is no direct evidence of prior abuse, and this remains purely speculative. Yet another theory maintains that Dior Jr. actually did wander off into the wilderness, and that his body simply hasn't been found yet. Proponents of this theory argue that the terrain is so vast and rugged, with countless places a small body could be hidden by nature, that it's entirely possible the extensive search has simply missed him. They point to cases where missing persons have been found years later in areas that were searched multiple times. They argue that the suspicious behavior of the parents could be explained by guilt over leaving the child unsupervised, by the stress of the investigation, or by poor decisions made in panic, rather than by actual culpability in the child's death. There are even more exotic theories involving third parties, strangers who might have been in the area and opportunistically abducted the child, though this seems highly unlikely given the remote location and the short time frame involved. Some have suggested that Isaac Ringwand, with his vague and unhelpful statements, might know more or have been more involved than has been publicly acknowledged. But investigators seem to have focused primarily on the parents, suggesting they don't find these alternative theories credible. The passage of time has done nothing to diminish the intensity of the investigation or the determination of those who believe Dior Jr. deserves justice. In the years following his disappearance, private investigators were brought into the case, hired by various parties including the extended family members who wanted answers. One of the most prominent was Philip Klein of Klein Investigations and Consulting, a respected private investigator from Texas with extensive experience in complex cases. Klein and his team conducted their own investigation, interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, and analyzing the statements given by Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. Klein's findings were damning. After months of investigation, he publicly stated that he believed Dior Jr. was dead, and that his death was the result of either negligence or intentional harm by his parents. Klein went further, saying that he believed the entire camping trip had been a ruse to cover up what had really happened to the child. He pointed to what he characterized as deceptive behavior by both parents, inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away by stress or confusion, and a pattern of changing stories that suggested consciousness of guilt. Klein's statements added credibility to the law enforcement theory that this was not a case of a lost child, but rather a homicide or manslaughter that had been covered up. The private investigator also made some specific claims about the evidence. He stated that based on his team's analysis, Dior Jr. had never actually been at the campground alive. This would mean that whatever happened to the child occurred before the family arrived at Timber Creek, lending support to the theory that the camping trip was staged from the beginning. Klein pointed to the lack of any credible sighting of the child at the campground by anyone other than the 4 adults who were there, the absence of any physical evidence that a living child had been present, and the timeline issues that made the parents' story increasingly implausible. These conclusions, coming from an independent investigator with no stake in protecting law enforcement's reputation or justifying their investigation, carried significant weight. But they also remained, like so much else in this case, a matter of interpretation and belief rather than definitive proof. Without Dior Jr.'s body, without a clear crime scene, the conclusions drawn by Klein and others were necessarily inferential, based on behavior and inconsistencies rather than on physical evidence of a crime. Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. responded to these accusations with a mix of anger, defiance, and despair. In various interviews over the years, they have maintained their innocence while also acknowledging that they understand why people might suspect them. Jessica has spoken emotionally about the hell of being suspected of harming your own child, while simultaneously grieving the loss of that child. She has described the impossibility of proving a negative, of trying to demonstrate that you didn't do something, when there's no evidence either way. She has talked about the toll the investigation has taken on her life, on her mental health, on her relationships, and on any sense of normalcy she might have hoped to regain. Dior Sr. has been somewhat less visible in media interviews, but has similarly maintained that he had nothing to do with his son's disappearance. He has expressed frustration with what he characterizes as a rush to judgment by law enforcement and the public, arguing that the real tragedy has been compounded by false accusations that have prevented the real truth from coming out. He has suggested that the focus on him and Jessica has potentially allowed the real answer to what happened to Dior Jr. to be overlooked, though he has never provided a clear alternative theory. The relationship between Jessica and Dior Sr. did not survive the aftermath of their son's disappearance. The stress of the investigation, the suspicion, the grief, and the constant scrutiny proved too much for the couple to bear. They eventually separated, each going their own way, though both remained under the shadow of the unsolved case. The separation added another layer of complexity to the investigation, as it raised questions about whether one might turn on the other, whether someone might confess or provide new information in exchange for immunity or a plea deal. But no such development occurred. Both have remained consistent in their denials, neither implicating the other in any specific wrongdoing beyond, perhaps, negligence in leaving the child unsupervised. The extended family of Dior Jr. has been vocal in their demands for justice and answers. Some family members have publicly stated their belief that Jessica and Dior Sr. are responsible for the child's death and should be prosecuted. Others have been more cautious, saying they don't know what happened but want the truth to come out whatever it may be. The family held memorials for Dior Jr. on the anniversaries of his disappearance, keeping his memory alive and maintaining pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing the case. They have appeared in media interviews, shared photos and memories of the little boy, and worked to ensure that he is not forgotten amid all the speculation and controversy. One particularly heart-wrenching aspect of the case is the impact on Dior Jr.'s extended family members who were not involved in whatever happened at that campground. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who loved the little boy have been left with an absence that can never be filled and questions that may never be answered. They have had to grapple with the possibility that someone they knew and trusted, perhaps even loved, might have harmed an innocent child. The destruction that Dior Jr.'s disappearance caused rippled far beyond just his immediate parents, tearing apart a larger family structure and leaving scars that will never fully heal. Robert Walton, the great-grandfather who was present at the campground, passed away in 2019 without ever providing clearances about what he might have seen or known about Dior Jr.'s disappearance. His death closed off one potential source of information, though given his age, health issues, and the vague nature of his previous statements, it's unclear whether he ever possessed crucial information that could have solved the case. Some investigators believe was simply an elderly man who was genuinely unaware of what transpired, while others have wondered if he knew more than he shared, either actively protecting family members or simply unable to fully process and communicate what he had witnessed. Isaac Reinwan remains a somewhat enigmatic figure in the case. He has given various interviews over the years, some to law enforcement and some to media, but his accounts have remained consistently vague and unhelpful. He has maintained that he doesn't know what happened to Dior Jr., that he wasn't paying close attention during the relevant time period, and that he has been truthful with investigators. Some have questioned whether Isaac's intellectual capacity might make him an unreliable witness, or whether he might be manipulated or coached by others. Others have suspected he knows more than he claims and has reasons to protect that information. But without more concrete evidence, Isaac remains on the periphery of the case, neither clearly implicated nor completely exonerated. The legal aspects of the case have been particularly complex and frustrating for those seeking justice for Dior Jr. Prosecutors face a nearly insurmountable challenge in pursuing charges without a body. While it is possible to prosecute homicide cases without recovering the victim's remains, such cases are notoriously difficult to win. The prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt not only that the person is dead but that they were killed by the defendant. Without a body, there is no autopsy, no cause of death, no forensic evidence of injury or foul play. The entire case rests on circumstantial evidence, inconsistent statements, and behavioral analysis, all of which can be challenged by a skilled defense attorney. Several attempts have been made over the years to move the case forward through the legal system. Grand juries have been convened, evidence has been presented, and prosecutors have sought indictments. But each time, the proceedings have concluded without charges being filed. The reasons for this have not been made fully public, but legal experts have speculated that prosecutors simply don't believe they have enough evidence to secure a conviction. The standard indictment is probable cause, a relatively low bar. But even that requires some solid foundation of evidence suggesting a crime occurred, and that specific individuals committed it. The circumstantial nature of the evidence in the Doerr-Kunz case, combined with the lack of physical proof, apparently has not been sufficient to meet even that threshold, or at least not sufficient to give prosecutors confidence in their ability to win at trial. This legal limbo has been excruciating for everyone involved. For Deorr Jr.'s extended family members who believe Jessica and Deorr Sr. are guilty, the inability to bring charges feels like a failure of justice, a system that cannot protect children or hold wrongdoers accountable. For Jessica and Deorr Sr. themselves, living under a cloud of suspicion without ever being formally charged or having an opportunity to defend themselves in court is its own kind of torture. They cannot clear their names through acquittal, cannot force the state to put up or shut up, and cannot move forward with their lives in any meaningful way. The case simply hangs there unresolved, a wound that cannot heal. From a law enforcement perspective, the case remains an active investigation, though the level of activity has necessarily diminished over time. Without new evidence or new leads, there is only so much that can be done. Investigators have reviewed the case file countless times, re-interviewed witnesses, consulted with experts in various fields, and explored every possible avenue of inquiry. They have used advanced forensic techniques, brought in specialists from outside agencies, and leveraged technology to analyze the evidence in new ways. But the fundamental problem remains: without Deorr Jr.'s body, without a confession, and without some definitive piece of physical evidence, the case cannot move forward. The searches for Deorr Jr. have been extensive and exhaustive. In the immediate aftermath of his disappearance, hundreds of searchers conserve acres of wilderness. In the years since, there have been periodic renewed search efforts, some organized by law enforcement, others by volunteers and family members. Advanced search techniques have been employed, including ground-penetrating radar, aerial surveys with sophisticated imaging equipment, and the use of highly trained cadaver dogs. Every one of these efforts has come up empty. The wilderness has yielded no trace of the missing child. Some experts have suggested that if Deorr Jr.'s body was hid in the vast Idaho wilderness, it might never be found. The terrain is incredibly rugged with countless ravines, thick forest coverage, and areas that are nearly inaccessible to searchers. Wild animals could have scattered remains, making discovery even more unlikely. The passage of time works against recovery as exposure to the elements would degrade any remains, making them harder to detect and identify. If someone deliberately concealed the body in a particularly remote or hidden location, the odds of discovery drop even further. Others maintain that if the child had simply wandered off and died of exposure or accident, search efforts should have found him. 2-year-olds don't travel far, they argue, and even in rough terrain. A body should have been discoverable, especially with the intensity of the initial search. The fact that absolutely nothing was not a piece of clothing, not any sign of the child, suggests to them that Deorr Jr. never entered the wilderness at all. This reasoning supports the theory that something happened to him before he ever reached the campground, or that his body was removed from the area entirely. The psychological aspects of the case have fascinated criminal psychologists and behavior analysts. if Jessica and Dior Sr. are indeed responsible for their son's death and disappearance. Their ability to maintain their stories and their public persona in the face of intense scrutiny is remarkable. They have given numerous interviews, faced aggressive questioning from law enforcement, endured public suspicion and vilification, and yet neither has cracked, neither has confessed or significantly changed their core story. This could indicate true innocence, or it could indicate a level of psychological compartmentalization and deception that is unusual even among those who commit serious crimes. Experts in deception detection have analyzed the parents' interviews and public statements, looking for telltale signs of lying or concealment. Some analysts have pointed to specific moments in interviews where they believe Jessica or Dior Sr. showed signs of changes in voice tone, body language inconsistencies, unusual word choices, or evasive responses to direct questions. Others have cautioned that such analysis is far from definitive, that people under extreme stress often display behaviors that might be misinterpreted as deception, and that without baseline comparisons and controlled conditions, it's impossible to draw firm conclusions from behavioral analysis alone. The role of media in the Dior Kunz case has been significant and controversial. The case has been covered extensively by both mainstream news outlets and true crime content creators on platforms like YouTube, podcasts, and social media. Some of this coverage has been responsible and informative, presenting the facts of the case and the various theories in a balanced way. Other coverage has been more sensational, making accusations, promoting unverified theories, and potentially prejudicing any future legal proceedings. Jessica and Dior Sr. have complained by media has made it impossible for them to get a fair hearing, while others argue that media attention has been necessary to keep pressure on the case and prevent it from being forgotten. The true crime community's obsession with the case has led to extensive amateur investigation. Online sleuths have pored over every detail, analyzed the geography of the campground, created timelines, and debated endlessly about what really happened. Some have traveled to Idaho to visit the site themselves, documenting their findings and sharing theories online. While some of this amateur investigation has been thoughtful and potentially useful, much of it has devolved into unfounded speculation and personal attacks on the individuals involved. The parents, in particular, have been subjected to online harassment and accusations that go far beyond what any evidence actually supports. One interesting development in the case came from an analysis of the family's financial records and communications in the period before Dior Jr.'s disappearance. Investigators looked at whether there were any unusual expenditures, searches, or activities that might shed light on what happened. They examined phone records, internet search histories, credit card transactions, and bank account activity. While the specific details of what they found have not been made public, investigators have indicated that they found some information of interest, though apparently nothing definitive enough to bring charges. This suggests there may have been some suspicious activity, but not so clearly incriminating as to constitute proof of a crime. The question of motive is one that has puzzled many observers of the case. If Jessica and Dior Sr. did harm their child, why would they do so? There is no evidence of a large insurance policy on the child that would provide financial motive. While the couple had relationship problems and financial stress, these are common issues and rarely lead to the murder of a child. Some have suggested that perhaps the child died accidentally, and the cover-up was motivated by fear of being charged with negligence or losing custody of any future children. Others have wondered if there might have been abuse or neglect that escalated to a fatal incident, with the cover driven by a desire to avoid prison. But without more information, any discussion of motive is necessarily speculative. The impact of Dior Jr.'s disappearance on the community where the family lived has been profound. The small-town setting where everyone knows everyone made the case particularly traumatic for the local population. People who knew the family, who had seen Dior Jr. playing at parks or shopping with his parents, struggled to reconcile those normal memories with the horrific possibility that the child had been murdered by those same parents. The community was divided, with some steadfastly defending Jessica and Dior Sr. and others convinced of their guilt. Friendships ended, arguments broke out, and the social fabric of the community was strained by the controversy. Schools and childcare facilities in the area used the case as an opportunity to review their own safety protocols and to educate parents about child supervision. The idea that a 2-year-old could vanish in just 15 or 20 minutes was a stark reminder of how quickly tragedy can strike when children are not properly watched. While the specifics of Dior Jr.'s case remain disputed, the broader lesson about the vulnerability of young children resonates with parents and caregivers throughout the region and beyond. The anniversary of Dior Jr.'s disappearance has become a focal point for renewed attention to the case. Each year on July 10th, family members, supporters, and those following the case mark the date with memorials, social media posts, and calls for justice. Media outlets often run anniversary stories, reviewing the case and any developments that have occurred in the past year. These anniversary moments serve to keep the case in the public consciousness and to remind law enforcement that people are still watching, still caring, still demanding answers. In recent years, there have been some who have called for the case to be turned over to federal authorities, arguing that local law enforcement may lack the resources or expertise to crack such a complex case. The FBI has been involved to some degree from early on, providing technical assistance and expertise, but primary investigative responsibility has remained with local and state authorities. Critics argue that a full federal takeover might bring fresh perspectives and additional resources that could finally break the case open. Supporters of local law enforcement counter that they have done everything possible with the evidence available, and that changing who it charge won't change the fundamental problem of a lack of physical evidence. Technological advances in forensic science have offered some hope that old evidence might yield new answers. Techniques for DNA analysis, for example, have become far more sophisticated in recent years, capable of extracting useful information from smaller and more degraded samples. If there was any biological evidence collected from the campground or the family's vehicles, it might be worth reanalyzing with modern techniques. Similarly, advances in digital forensics, cell phone tracking, and data analysis might reveal patterns or information that were not apparent with older technology. However, if such reanalysis has been conducted, the results have not been made public. The question of whether Dior Jr. is still alive, though extremely unlikely given the circumstances and the passage of time, cannot be entirely ruled out without a body. Some have clung to the hope, however faint, that perhaps the child was abducted and is still alive somewhere, perhaps raised by someone else who doesn't know his true identity. This scenario seems far-fetched given the remote location and the lack of any evidence of outside involvement, but in the absence of definitive proof of death, it remains a theoretical possibility. Over the years, there have been occasional reported sightings of children who supposedly resembled Dior Jr., but none of these have panned out. Each was investigated and ruled out, leaving the family and investigators no closer to answers. The emotional toll on Jessica Mitchell specifically has been documented in various interviews she has given over the years. She has spoken about the guilt of leaving her son at the campsite that day, regardless of what ultimately happened to him. Even in the best-case scenario for her, where she is completely innocent and Dior simply wandered off, she carries the burden of that decision to leave him behind while she and Dior Sr. went to explore. She has described the nightmare of being suspected of murdering your own child, of having people look at you with hatred and disgust, of being unable to grieve properly because you're constantly defending yourself. Her accounts are emotional and compelling, leading some to believe in her innocence, while others view them as manipulative performances designed to garner sympathy. Dior Sr. has been less forthcoming in public forums, giving fewer interviews and generally maintaining a lower profile than Jessica. This has led to speculation about why he has been less visible. Some suggest it's because he has more to hide, that he is less capable of maintaining the deception under public scrutiny. Others argue that it's simply a personality difference, that he grieves more privately and is less comfortable with media attention. His relative silence has not helped his public image, as many interpret it as suspicious, but from a legal standpoint, Saying less is often the smarter strategy when you are under investigation. The legal representation for both Jessica has evolved over the years as the case has dragged on. Both have had multiple attorneys, some hired privately and others appointed or working pro bono. The lawyers have faced the difficult task of defending clients who are widely suspected of terrible crimes, but have never been charged, meaning there is no formal legal proceeding in which to mount a defense. The attorneys have had to balance advising their clients to remain silent to protect their legal interests, while also recognizing that public silence can be interpreted as guilt. It's a no-win situation in many respects. One aspect of the case that has received less attention, but is nonetheless significant, is the impact on the search and rescue community. The volunteers who spent days and weeks searching for Dior Jr., believing they were looking for a lost child who might still be alive, have had to grapple with the possibility that they were participating in an elaborate deception. If the theories about the parents are correct, then all those hours of dangerous, exhausting searching were for nothing, a wild goose chase designed to cover up a crime. For volunteers who donated their time and energy out of compassion and a desire to help, this realization has been disillusioning and painful. The case has also raised broader questions about how law enforcement handles missing children cases, particularly in remote areas. Should initial responses assume the possibility of foul play even when the story seems straightforward? How much should investigators rely on the statements of parents and family members versus treating everyone as a potential suspect from the outset? The Dior Kunz case suggests that more skepticism earlier on might have been warranted, though it's also true that in the vast majority of cases, where a child goes missing in the wilderness, it is exactly what it appears to be: a tragic accident with no criminal intent. Balancing the need to mount an immediate search with the need to preserve evidence and investigate potential crimes is an ongoing challenge. Comparisons have been drawn between the Dior Kunz case and other high-profile cases of missing children where the parents were eventually found to be responsible. Cases like Caylee Anthony, Gabriel Fernandez, and others have shown that sometimes those who should be protecting children are the very ones who harm them. The patterns in those cases, the lying to investigators, the inconsistent stories, the lack of emotion or inappropriate emotional displays, all have parallels in the Dior Kunz case, but comparisons can only go so far. Each case is unique, and similarities don't constitute proof. The legal system requires evidence specific to the case at hand, not just pattern matching with other cases. There have been moments over the years when it seemed like a breakthrough might be imminent. News reports of new evidence being analyzed, of witnesses being re-interviewed, of grand juries being convened, all raised hopes that finally there would be resolution. But each time the momentum faded, the news cycle moved on, and the case returned to its frustrating state of limbo. These false dawns have been emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, raising hopes only to dash them repeatedly. The role of social media in the case has been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has kept the case in the public eye, spread information widely, and allowed people from across the country to contribute tips and theories. On the other hand, it has facilitated the spread of misinformation, enabled harassment of the individuals involved, and created echo chambers where people reinforce each other's beliefs without critical examination of evidence. The Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and YouTube videos devoted to the case number in the hundreds, each with their own theories and perspectives, ranging from thoughtful analysis to wild conspiracy theories. The passage of years has brought no closure to the Dior Kunz Jr. case, only an accumulation of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions. As the investigation stretched from months into years, the initial urgency and public attention began to wane, replaced by a kind of resigned awareness that this might be one of those cases that never gets solved. The little boy who disappeared from Timber Creek Campground in July 2015 became a symbol of unsolved mysteries, a reminder that even in the age of advanced forensics and intensive investigation, some truths remain stubbornly hidden. The investigators who worked the case most intensively have spoken about it with a mixture of professional frustration and personal anguish. These are experienced law enforcement professionals who have solved countless cases, who pride themselves on their ability to find the truth and bring justice to victims. To have a case where they feel certain they know what happened, or at least who is responsible, but cannot prove it in a way that meets the legal standard for prosecution, is profoundly dissatisfying. Some have said the Deorr Kunz case haunts them, that they think about that little boy and what might have happened to him, that they continue to hope for the one piece of evidence or the one witness statement that will finally break the case wide open. Sheriff Steve Penner, who took over the case after the initial investigation and became one of its most visible faces, has given several interviews over the years discussing the challenges and frustrations. He has been careful to avoid saying things that might compromise any future prosecution, but he has made it clear that he believes Deorr Jr. is deceased and that his death was not the result of an accident or a child wandering off into the wilderness. Penner has described the investigation as one of the most difficult of his career, complicated by the lack of physical evidence, the remote location, and the passage of time. He has also expressed confidence that eventually the truth will come out, though he acknowledges that it may take longer than anyone would like. The prosecutor's office has faced its own set of challenges in deciding how to proceed with the case. Without a body and without definitive physical evidence of a crime, the decision to charge someone is fraught with risk. If they bring charges and cannot secure a conviction, the defendants cannot be tried again for the same crime due to double jeopardy protections. This means prosecutors essentially get one shot, and if they take that shot prematurely with insufficient evidence, they might blow the only chance for justice that Deorr Jr. will ever get. This calculus has apparently led to a conservative approach, with prosecutors choosing to wait for more evidence rather than risk a failed prosecution. Legal experts who have analyzed the case from the outside have been divided on whether prosecutors should have brought charges by now. Some argue that the circumstantial evidence, while not overwhelming, is sufficient to present to a jury, and that juries have convicted on less in other cases. They point to the failed polygraphs, the inconsistent statements, the suspicious timeline, and the lack of any evidence that Deorr Jr. ever entered the wilderness as enough to create a narrative of guilt that a jury might accept. Others counter that without a body, without a clear cause of death, and without any direct evidence linking the parents to harm against their child, a conviction would be extremely difficult to obtain, and prosecutors are right to be cautious. The FBI's involvement in the case, while significant in terms of providing resources and expertise, has not resulted in the kind of breakthrough that some had hoped for. Federal agents conducted their own interviews, analyzed evidence using FBI laboratory facilities, and provided behavioral analysis support to local investigators. They brought in specialists in child abduction, homicide, and evidence analysis. But even with these additional resources, the fundamental obstacles remained. The FBI's contribution was valuable but not transformative, unable to overcome the basic problem of insufficient physical evidence. One of the most detailed examinations of the case came from the private investigator Philip Klein, whose work was commissioned by parties seeking answers. Klein's investigation included extensive interviews with Jessica Mitchell and Deorr Kunz Sr., analysis of their statements, examination of the timeline and physical evidence, and consultation with various experts. His final report, portions of which were made public, concluded that both parents were being deceptive about crucial aspects of the case, and that Deorr Jr. had never been alive at the campground. Klein went so far as to suggest that investigators should focus on the period before the family arrived at Timber Creek, looking at what happened in the hours and days leading up to the camping trip. Klein's methodology involved detailed analysis of the parents' statements, looking for specific markers of deception. He noted changes in pronoun use, unusual levels of detail in certain parts of their accounts and vagueness in others, defensive responses to questions that should have been straightforward, and what he characterized as rehearsed-sounding narratives. He also pointed to the lack of any independent verification that Deorr Jr. was alive and well when the family left for the camping trip. The convenience store footage showing the parents, but not the child was particularly significant in Klein's analysis. He argued that if the child had been in the vehicle, alive and well, it would be natural for at least one parent to mention him, or for him to be visible in some way during the stop. The convenience store video has indeed become one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in the case. Enhanced and analyzed frame by frame, it shows Jessica and Dior Sr. entering the store, making a purchase, and leaving. The interior of their vehicle is not visible in great detail, making it impossible to definitively determine whether Dior Jr. was present. The parents have maintained that he was in the vehicle, possibly sleeping, which is why he wasn't brought into the store. But the lack of any visual confirmation, combined with the fact that this was one of the last known locations before the family headed to the remote campground, has made this video a focal point of suspicion. Investigators also looked carefully at the camping equipment and supplies the family had with them. They analyzed whether the amount and type of gear was consistent with a family planning a genuine camping trip with a 2-year-old child. Some have suggested that certain items one would expect for a toddler, such as favorite toys, comfort items, or adequate clothing and supplies, were conspicuously absent or insufficient. Others have countered that not all parents pack the same way, and that the presence or absence of specific items proves nothing. This kind of analysis, while potentially suggestive, falls far short of the kind of concrete evidence needed for a prosecution. The timeline of the family's movements on the day Dior Jr. disappeared has been reconstructed and analyzed exhaustively. Investigators mapped out the route the family took to the campground, identified places they stopped, and tried to verify their account of when they arrived and what they did. They interviewed other campers who were in the area, asking if anyone had seen the family or specifically noticed a small child with them. The results of these inquiries have not been made fully public, but it appears that investigators found few if any independent witnesses who could confirm seeing Dior Jr. alive at the campground. The camping spot itself was processed as a potential crime scene, though the initial search and rescue operation had already contaminated much of the area before investigators began to suspect foul play. Forensic teams combed through the campsite looking for any physical evidence of what might have happened. They collected soil samples, examined the vehicles thoroughly, and looked for any signs of blood, bodily fluids, or other biological evidence. The cadaver dog alerts on the vehicles suggested the presence of human remains at some point, but without finding the body itself. This evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. It's possible the dogs were alerting to trace amounts of decomposition, scent that could have been transferred from another source. Though this seems unlikely, the psychological profile of Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kun Sr. has been a subject of interest for behavioral analysts working the case. Neither parent had a prior criminal history involving violence or child abuse. There were no previous reports to Child Protective Services, no documented history of harming children, and by most accounts, they appeared to be typical young parents struggling with the normal challenges of raising a toddler. This lack of prior warning signs makes the case more puzzling if they were indeed responsible for their son's death. Most parents who kill their children show some prior indicators, a history of abuse, severe mental health issues, or extreme life stressors. While Jessica and Dior Sr. certainly had stressors in their lives, nothing in their background screamed high risk for child homicide. Some psychologists have suggested that if the parents were responsible, the most likely scenario might involve an accidental death, followed by a panicked cover-up rather than premeditated murder. In this theory, something happened to Dior Jr., perhaps a fall, an unintentional overdose of medication, or some other tragic accident, and the parents, terrified of being blamed or losing custody of any future children, made the catastrophic decision to hide what happened rather than seeking help. This scenario would explain the lack of prior warning signs, and might account for their ability to maintain their story, as they might rationalize that they didn't actually murder their child, just covered up an accident. The impact of the case on investigative practices and policies has been notable. Law enforcement agencies across the country have studied the Dior Kunz case as an example of the challenges involved in missing children investigations in remote areas. Training programs for search and rescue teams now include modules on preserving potential crime scenes, even while conducting urgent searches for missing persons. The case has highlighted the tension between the immediate need to find a missing child and the importance of treating the scene with the care required for a potential criminal investigation. The media coverage of the case, while extensive, has also been criticized for potentially compromising any future trial. So much has been said and written about the case, with so many accusations and theories aired publicly, that finding an unbiased jury would be extremely difficult if charges were ever filed. Defense attorneys could argue that their clients cannot receive a fair trial anywhere in Idaho, and possibly not anywhere in the United States, given the national coverage the case has received. This is yet another complication that prosecutors must consider when deciding whether and when to bring charges. The true crime podcasts and YouTube channels that have covered the Dior Kunz case have brought it to an even wider audience, introducing the story to people who might never have heard of it through traditional media. Some of this coverage has been responsible and well-researched, presenting multiple perspectives and acknowledging the limitations of what is actually known. Other coverage has been more sensational, presenting theories as facts and making accusations that go beyond what the evidence supports. The family members of Dior Jr. have had mixed reactions to this attention, with some appreciating the continued focus on the case, while others feeling that it has become a form of entertainment that disrespects the memory of a real child who suffered a real tragedy. The online communities dedicated to discussing the case have developed their own culture and dynamics. Regular participants debate the minutiae of the evidence, share new information or theories, and sometimes engage in amateur investigation themselves. Some have created detailed maps of the campground area, analyzed photographs and videos frame by frame, and even traveled to Idaho to visit the location. While some of this activity has been constructive, much of it exists in a gray area between legitimate public interest and inappropriate obsession with a real-life tragedy. The families involved, particularly Jessica and Dior Sr., have been subjected to ongoing harassment and threats from individuals convinced of their guilt. The question of what Jessica and Dior Sr. are doing now, years after their son's disappearance, is one that many followers of the case wonder about. Both have tried to move on with their lives to some extent, though the shadow of the case and the ongoing suspicion make any kind of normal life difficult. They cannot hold certain jobs, as background checks reveal their connection to the case, and the fact that they are considered suspects by law enforcement. They cannot escape the whispers and stares in public, the knowledge that many people believe they are child killers who have escaped justice. This existence, neither fully accused nor fully exonerated, is its own kind of punishment. Though for those who believe they are guilty, it is far less than they deserve. Jessica has been somewhat more visible on social media than Dior Sr., occasionally posting about her life and addressing the case. These posts are often met with hostile comments from those convinced of her guilt, forcing her to moderate or limit interactions. She has spoken about the difficulty of dating and forming new relationships when your past includes being suspected of murdering your child. She has talked about her mental health struggles, including depression and anxiety stemming from the trauma of losing her son and being accused of causing his death. Whether these statements evoke sympathy or skepticism depends largely on the prior beliefs of those reading them. Dior Sr. has maintained an even lower profile, with little public social media presence and few interviews or statements. This silence is interpreted differently by different observers. Some see it as the behavior of someone with nothing more to say, who has told his truth and is now simply trying to survive under impossible circumstances. Others view it as the strategic silence of someone who knows that every word he says could potentially be used against him, either in the court of public opinion or in an actual court of law should charges ever be filed. The extended family members who have spoken publicly about the case have expressed a range of emotions and opinions. Some have stood by Jessica and Dior Sr., insisting on their innocence and arguing that they are being unfairly persecuted. These family members have organized support efforts, shared posts defending the parents, and tried to counter what they see as a rush to judgment. Other family members have been more circumspect, saying they don't know what happened but want the truth to emerge. And some have publicly stated their belief that Jessica and Dior Sr. know more than they're saying, and should be held accountable for whatever role they played in Dior Jr.'s disappearance. The photographs of Dior Jr. that circulated after his disappearance show a beautiful, happy child with his whole life ahead of him. In some photos, he's smiling at the camera, his blonde hair catching the light. In others, he's engaged in typical toddler activities, playing with toys, exploring his environment, enjoying simple pleasures. These images serve as a poignant reminder of what was lost, a life full of potential cut tragically short. They humanize a case that could otherwise become just another set of facts and theories, reminding everyone involved that at the center of all this speculation and investigation is a real child who deserves justice. The anniversary tributes to Dior Jr. have evolved over the years. Early on, they were marked by vigils and searches, with volunteers returning to the Timber Creek area to look for any sign of the missing boy that might have been overlooked. As time passed and the likelihood of finding him through searching diminished, the tributes became more memorial in nature, focusing on remembering Dior Jr. and keeping pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. Family members release balloons, share memories, and post photos on social media. These annual moments serve multiple purposes, honoring Dior Jr.'s memory, keeping the case in the public consciousness, and reminding investigators that people are still waiting for answers. The question of whether Dior Jr. will ever be found, and whether anyone will ever be held accountable for his disappearance, remains open. Cases have been solved decades after the crime occurred, sometimes through deathbed confessions, sometimes through advances in technology, sometimes through a chance discovery of remains in an unexpected location. It's possible that one day, years or even decades from now, a hiker will stumble across bones in the Idaho wilderness, and testing will reveal they belong to Dior Kunz Jr. It's possible that someone involved in the case will eventually break their silence, unable to carry the burden of knowledge any longer. It's possible that a new forensic technique will allow old evidence to reveal secrets it has kept hidden. But it's also possible that this case will never be solved, that Dior Jr.'s fate will remain a mystery, and that Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. will live the rest of their lives under a cloud of suspicion without ever being formally charged or conclusively proven guilty or innocent. This outcome, while deeply unsatisfying, is not uncommon in cases where a body is never found and physical evidence is limited. The justice system, for all its resources and determination, cannot always deliver the answers and accountability that victims and their families deserve. The broader implications of the Dior Kunz case extend beyond the specifics of what happened to one little boy in Idaho. The case raises questions about parental responsibility, about the importance of constant supervision for young children, about the decisions we make in moments of convenience and can have catastrophic consequences. Even if Jessica and Dior Sr. are completely innocent of any intentional harm to their son, the decision to leave a 2-year-old at a campsite with an elderly, possibly dozing great-grandfather and an inattentive friend while they went exploring was a lapse in judgment with potentially fatal results. The case also highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement in an era where public expectations for swift justice are high, but the legal standards for prosecution remain appropriately strict. The public, influenced by television crime dramas, where every case is solved in an hour with definitive forensic evidence, often doesn't understand why cases like Dior Kunz's cannot be quickly resolved. The reality is that investigations are messy, evidence is often ambiguous, and proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is a high bar that exists to protect the innocent, even when it sometimes seems to protect the guilty as well. For the search and rescue community, the Dior Kunz case has become a cautionary tale about the importance of treating every missing person case as a potential crime scene from the outset. While the primary mission must always be to find the missing person as quickly as possible, particularly when it's a child whose life may hang in the balance. There is also a need to preserve evidence and maintain investigative awareness. The extensive searches for Dior Jr., while conducted with the best of intentions, may have inadvertently destroyed evidence that could have been crucial to understanding what really happened. The role of private investigators like Philip Klein in the case demonstrates how wealthy individuals, or those with access to resources, can supplement official investigations with their own efforts. Klein's work brought additional scrutiny and analysis to the case, and his public statements certainly influenced public opinion. But private investigations also exist in a murky area, not bound by the same legal constraints as official law enforcement but also lacking the same authority and access. The conclusions reached by private investigators, no matter how experienced and credible they may be, do not carry the weight of official findings and cannot be used as the basis for prosecution. The impact on the small community where the family lived before Dior Jr.'s disappearance cannot be overstated. In tight-knit communities, a case like this doesn't just affect the immediate family but ripples outward, touching everyone. People who thought they the family are forced to reevaluate their judgments. Trust is eroded, as people wonder who among them might be capable of terrible things. The community becomes divided between those who defend the accused and those who condemn them, creating rifts that can last for years. Children in the community grow up with this case as part of their local history, a dark story that shapes their understanding of their hometown. For other parents of young children, the Dior Kunz case serves as a terrifying reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. The idea that you could turn your back for just 15 or 20 minutes and return to find your child gone forever is the stuff of nightmares. It has made many parents more vigilant, more aware of the dangers that exist even in seemingly safe environments. Whether Dior Jr. wandered off into the wilderness or something more sinister occurred, the lesson is the same. Constant supervision is not optional, it is essential, and the consequences of even a brief lapse can be devastating. The case has also sparked discussions about the challenges of camping with very young children in remote wilderness areas. Is it appropriate to take a 2-year-old to such an isolated location? What safety precautions should be mandatory? Should there be guidelines or recommendations for parents about the minimum age for wilderness camping? While most people would argue that with proper supervision and precautions, family camping can be a wonderful experience at any age, the Dior Kunz case demonstrates the serious risks involved when things go wrong in locations where help is far away and dangers are present. The theories surrounding what happened to Dior Kunz Jr. have grown more elaborate and numerous as the years have passed without resolution. Amateur detectives and armchair investigators have spent countless hours developing scenarios, some based on careful analysis of available evidence, others venturing into speculation that borders on the fantastical. Each theory attempts to explain the central mystery of how a 2-year-old child could vanish so completely, leaving behind no trace despite extensive searching and investigation. One of the most prevalent theories, and the one that appears to have the most support from law enforcement, is that Dior Jr. died before the family ever reached the campground, and that the entire camping trip was a staged event designed to provide cover for disposing of his body and explaining his disappearance. In this scenario, something happened to Dior Jr. in the days or hours before the family left for Timber Creek, perhaps an accident, perhaps the result of abuse or neglect, perhaps something else entirely. Faced with the terrible reality of a dead child and the potential consequences of reporting what had happened, Jessica and Dor Sr. allegedly decided to hide the death. This theory suggests that the parents brought Dior Jr.'s body with them to the remote campground, possibly hidden in the vehicle or wrapped in camping gear. Once at the isolated location, they waited for an opportune moment to dispose of the body somewhere in the vast wilderness, where it would likely never be found. The story of the child wandering off while in the care of his great-grandfather provided a plausible explanation that would trigger a massive search effort, during which any evidence at the campsite would be contaminated by the dozens or hundreds of searchers trampling through the area. The failed polygraph tests, the inconsistent statements, and the absence of any evidence that Dior Jr. was alive at the campground all support this theory. The convenience store video plays a crucial role in this theory. If Dior Jr. was not visible or mentioned during that stop, it could be because he was already deceased in the vehicle. The parents might have made the stop to establish a timeline. To be seen on camera as apparently normal and going about typical camping trip preparations while hiding the terrible truth of what was actually in their vehicle. The fact that they then proceeded to an extremely remote location, far from witnesses and surveillance, fits the pattern of someone planning to dispose of evidence, rather than simply going on a family camping trip. A variation of this theory suggests that Dior Jr. might have died at the campground itself, but early in the visit, perhaps even on the first evening after they arrived. In this scenario, something happened to the child during the night or early morning, an accident or an incident of abuse, and the parents spent the time until they reported him missing trying to hide the body and staged the scene to make it look like he had wandered off. This would explain why they might have seemed calm or not immediately frantic when they first returned to the campsite and found him gone. They already knew he was dead and had spent time preparing their story. Another theory, less supported by investigators but still discussed among those following the case, is that Dior Jr. actually did wander away from the campsite and died of exposure or accident in the wilderness, but that his body ended up in a location so remote or so well hidden by natural circumstances that it has never been found. Proponents of this theory point to the vast, rugged terrain surrounding the campground and argue that a small child's remains could easily be missed even in extensive searches. They note cases where hikers or missing persons have been found years later in areas that were searched multiple times, their bodies hidden in ravines, covered by deadfall, or scattered by animals. In this accidental death scenario, the suspicious behavior of the parents, their failed polygraphs and inconsistent statements, would be explained not by guilt over causing Dior Jr.'s death, but by guilt over their negligence in leaving him unsupervised. Knowing that they had made a terrible decision that resulted in their child's death, they might have become defensive, changed details of their story to minimize their culpability, or behaved in ways that seemed deceptive because they were trying to protect themselves from charges of child endangerment or negligent homicide. The stress of the investigation, combined with genuine grief and guilt, could have caused them to fail polygraph examinations, even if they were not directly responsible for their son's death. This theory requires believing that the extensive searches simply missed Dior Jr.'s body, which search and rescue experts say is possible, but unlikely given the intensity of the effort. It also requires explaining the cadaver dog alerts on the vehicles, which suggest the presence of human remains at some point. Supporters of the accidental death theory might argue that the dog alerts could have been false positives, or could have detected tray decomposition transferred from the area where Dior Jr. died in the wilderness back to the vehicles during the search efforts. A darker theory that has circulated suggests that Dior Jr.'s disappearance was premeditated, that one or both parents had decided they no longer wanted the responsibility of raising a child and planned his death in advance. This theory is supported by some who point to the choice of such a remote location, the apparent lack of adequate supplies for a toddler, and what they interpret as a lack of genuine emotion from the parents in their public appeals. However, this theory requires attributing a level of cold-blooded calculation to the parents that seems inconsistent with their backgrounds, and with the lack of any apparent strong motive for wanting their child dead. The premeditation theory struggles to explain why the parents would go through such an elaborate scheme, rather than simply giving the child up for adoption, or to family members if they truly didn't want him. It also doesn't align with accounts from people who knew the family before Dior Jr.'s disappearance, most of whom described them as typical young parents who seemed to love their child. While people can certainly hide dark intentions, the complete absence of any warning signs or prior concerning behavior makes this theory seem less plausible than others. Some have theorized about the possible involvement of Isaac Reinwand beyond simply being an unhelpful witness. Could Isaac have harmed Dior Jr., perhaps accidentally, and the parents are covering for him? Could Isaac have been asked to dispose of the body while the parents created their alibi by going to explore the creek? Isaac's vague and uncertain statements, his reported intellectual limitations, and his presence at the campground make him a figure of interest. However, investigators seem to have focused primarily on the parents, suggesting they don't find Isaac to be a likely perpetrator. His inconclusive polygraph results don't particularly point guilt or innocence, and without more evidence, his role remains unclear. There have been theories involving other people who might have been in the area, strangers who could have abducted Dior Jr. during the brief window when he was unsupervised. This scenario is extremely unlikely given the remote location, the short time frame, and the lack of any evidence of outside involvement. For a stranger abduction to have occurred, someone would have had to be in the immediate vicinity of the campground, watching for an opportunity, and then manage to take the child and leave without being seen or leaving any trace. While not impossible, this seems far less probable than scenarios involving the people who were actually present. The possibility of wild animal involvement has also been discussed, particularly given the presence of bears and mountain lions in the Idaho wilderness. Could Dior Jr. have wandered away and been killed and carried off by a predator? Again, while not impossible, this seems unlikely. Predator attacks on humans are rare, and attacks on children, while more common than attacks on adults, still usually leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks, or other signs of a struggle. The complete absence of any such evidence makes this scenario improbable, though not entirely impossible. As the investigation continued over the years, law enforcement pursued various leads and investigated numerous tips that came in from the public. Some of these tips seemed promising initially, but led nowhere upon investigation. Others were clearly from people seeking attention or confused about what they had seen. The challenge for investigators was separating the potentially valuable information from the noise of irrelevant or false reports. Each tip had to be evaluated and investigated to some degree, consuming time and resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. One lead that received significant attention involved reports of a person matching Dior Jr.'s description, being seen in various locations after his disappearance. These reported sightings came from different states and different contexts, some claiming to have seen a child matching us with adults who seemed nervous or suspicious. In each case, investigators followed up, often coordinating with local law enforcement in other jurisdictions to check out the reports. In every instance, the child in question turned out to be someone else, a case of mistaken identity or wishful thinking on the part of the witness. The psychological impact of these false leads on Dior Jr.'s extended family was significant. Each report would spark hope that perhaps he was still alive, that perhaps he had been abducted and could be recovered and returned. When each lead was debunked, the disappointment was crushing, reopening wounds and forcing family members to confront again the likelihood that Dior Jr. was gone forever. This emotional roller coaster added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. The forensic analysis of the vehicles belonging to the family was extensive. Investigators went through the vehicles multiple times, looking for any trace of evidence that might explain what happened to Dior Jr. They examined the interior surfaces for blood or other biological material, checked for fibers or hairs that might be significant, and looked for any signs that a body had been transported in the vehicle. The cadaver dog alert suggested that at some point, human remains had been present, but without finding additional confirming evidence, this alone was not sufficient to prove a crime had occurred. Modern forensic techniques can detect incredibly small amounts of biological material, and investigators utilized these capabilities to the fullest extent. They used luminol and other chemical reagents to reveal potential blood stains that might have been cleaned up. They examined the vehicles under different types of lighting to reveal evidence that might not be visible to the naked eye. They took samples from drains, crevasses, and other areas where material might accumulate and be difficult to clean. Despite these efforts, they apparently did not find the kind of definitive evidence that would prove Dior Jr.'s body had been in the vehicles. though the exact details of what they did or didn't find have not been made fully public. The camping gear and personal belongings that the family had with them were similarly analyzed. Investigators looked at the clothing Duor Jr. had allegedly been wearing when he disappeared, trying to determine if it showed any signs of having been involved in a struggle, an accident, or foul play. They examined the other items the family had packed, looking for anything unusual or suspicious. They documented every item, photographed everything, and preserved what might be potential evidence. But again, without more context or without finding Duor Jr. himself. Most of this material evidence could not definitively answer the questions at the heart of the case. The timeline reconstruction efforts involved not just mapping out what the family claimed to have done, but also trying to verify their movements through other means. Investigators looked at cell phone records to see if they could track the family's movements through cell tower pings, though the remote location and spotty coverage made this difficult. They examined credit card and debit card transactions to see where the family had stopped and what they had purchased. They interviewed store clerks, gas station attendants, and anyone else who might have interacted with the family during their trip to the campground. One aspect of the timeline that received particular scrutiny was the exact time when the family arrived at the campground. Were there other campers who saw them arrive? Did anyone notice whether Duor Jr. was with them and appeared to be alive and well? Investigators interviewed everyone they could find who had been at or near Timber Creek Campground around the relevant dates. Some campers remembered seeing the family, others didn't. Of those who remembered them, their recollections of whether they specifically saw the child were often vague or uncertain. This is not surprising given that people are generally not paying close attention to other campers' families, but it meant there was little independent verification of the parents' account. The role of cell phone data in modern investigations has become increasingly important, and the Duor Kunz case was no exception. Investigators obtained and analyzed the cell phone records for both Jessica Mitchell and Duor Kunz Sr., looking at call logs, text messages, location data, and internet search history. They were particularly interested in any searches or communications in the days or weeks before the camping trip that might indicate premeditation or consciousness of guilt. They looked for searches about how to dispose of a body, about whether children could survive in the wilderness, about search and rescue procedures, or anything else that might be relevant. While the specific details of what was found in the cell phone records have not been publicly disclosed, the fact that charges have not been filed suggests that investigators did not find the kind of smoking gun evidence they were hoping for. Modern cell phone forensics can reveal a tremendous amount of information about a person's activities and state of mind, but only if that person was careless enough to leave a digital trail. If Jessica and Duor Sr. were planning something terrible and were careful to avoid leaving incriminating evidence on their phones, or if their suspicious behavior was simply the result of panic and poor decisions rather than premeditation, the phone records might not reveal much of value. Social media activity also came under scrutiny. Investigators looked at the Facebook posts, Instagram photos, and other social media activity of both parents in the time leading up to Duor Jr.'s disappearance. They were looking for any indication of stress, relationship problems, financial difficulties, or other factors that might provide context for understanding what happened. They also looked at the posts and interactions after the disappearance, analyzing the language used, the emotions expressed, and whether anything seemed inconsistent with genuine grief and concern for a missing child. The analysis of social media posts for signs of deception or guilt is a relatively new but increasingly common investigative technique. Experts in statement analysis and linguistic forensics can sometimes identify patterns in how people write and communicate that suggest deception. For example, guilty parties might avoid using their victim's name, might speak in the past tense about someone they claim to believe is still alive, or might focus more on defending themselves than on the victim. Whether such analysis revealed anything significant in Jessica and Duor Sr.'s social media activity is not publicly known, but it was certainly part of the investigative effort. The financial situation of the family before Dior Jr.'s disappearance was examined to determine if there might be a monetary motive for harming the child. Investigators looked for life insurance policies on Dior Jr., debt problems that might create desperation, or unusual financial transactions that might be relevant. They found a family that was struggling financially, as many young families do, but no obvious financial motive for wanting their child dead. There was no large insurance policy, no inheritance that would come to them upon the child's death, nothing that would make harming him financially beneficial. The lack of a clear motive has been one of the puzzling aspects of the case for those who believe the parents are responsible. Why would they harm their child? What would they gain from it? In most cases where parents kill their children, there is some identifiable motive, even if it's a twisted or irrational one. They might be trying to hide abuse, might see the child as an obstacle to a new relationship, might be suffering from severe mental illness, or might be acting out of rage or frustration. In the Dior Kunz case, no such clear motive has been established, which has led some to theorize that if the parents were involved, it was likely covering up an accident rather than a deliberate act. The stress on the relationship between Jessica and Dior Sr., already strained by the normal challenges of young parenthood and financial difficulties, was reportedly increased in the months before Dior Jr.'s disappearance. Some who knew the couple said they argued frequently, that they seemed unhappy, and that there were tensions in their relationship. Whether these relationship problems had any bearing on what happened to Dior Jr. is unknown, but investigators certainly looked at the possibility that relationship stress might have created an environment where something terrible could happen. The impact of substance abuse was also investigated. Did either parent have drug or alcohol problems that might impair their contribute to neglectful behavior? Were they using substances during the camping trip that might have affected their ability to supervise their child or remember accurately what happened? While there have been some reports suggesting substance use might have been a factor, the specific details have not been made public, and it's unclear whether this played any significant role in Dior Jr.'s disappearance. The question of mental health has also been raised. Did either parent suffer from depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions that might be relevant? Were they receiving treatment or taking medications that might affect their behavior or memory? Mental health issues can certainly contribute to poor decision making and can sometimes be a factor in cases where parents harm their children, though the vast majority of people with mental health conditions would never hurt a child. Without access to medical records and detailed psychological evaluations, it's difficult to assess whether mental health played any role in this case. The extended family's dynamics and relationships have also been examined. Were there tensions or conflicts within the larger family that might be relevant? Did anyone have concerns about how Jessica and Dior Sr. were parenting Dior Jr. before the camping trip? Were there warning signs that were missed or ignored? Family members who have spoken publicly have generally said they saw no indication that Dior Jr. was at risk, that he seemed like a normal, happy child, and that his parents seemed to love him. But family members are not always the most objective observers, and people can hide problems even from those close to them. The role of great-grandfather Robert Walton, who has since passed away, remains somewhat mysterious. His health problems and cognitive issues made him an unreliable witness, but did he know more than he was able to communicate? Did he see something that day that he couldn't articulate clearly, or that he tried to share but was misunderstood? Some have speculated that Robert might have witnessed something important, but lacked the capacity to effectively tell investigators what he had seen. His death eliminated any possibility of eventually getting clearer information from him, though given his condition, it's questionable whether he ever could have provided more useful testimony. The decision by law enforcement to publicly name Jessica and Dior Sr. as suspects while not filing charges was controversial. On one hand, it put public pressure on individuals who might know something to come forward, and it signaled to the community that this was being taken seriously as a potential crime rather than just a missing person case. On the other hand, It subjected two people who have not been convicted of any crime to intense public scrutiny, suspicion, and harassment. The balance between the public's right to information and an individual's right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty is always delicate, and in this case, reasonable people can disagree about whether the right balance was struck. The passage of time has brought subtle shifts in how the case is perceived and discussed, but the fundamental questions remain unanswered. As Deorr Kunz Jr.'s disappearance receded from the immediate headlines and became part of the catalog of unsolved mysteries, the nature of the public discourse around it began to change. What was once a story of urgent searches and breaking developments became a cold case, analyzed and debated by people who approach it more as a puzzle to be solved than as a fresh tragedy demanding immediate action. The cold case status has not meant the investigation has been abandoned, but rather that it has shifted to a different mode. Instead of active searching and intensive daily investigation, the case is now characterized by periodic reviews of the evidence, follow-up on occasional new tips, and waiting for the kind of break that might come from unexpected sources. Investigators have other cases demanding their immediate attention, but Deorr Jr.'s file remains open, and those who worked it most intensively have not forgotten the little boy whose fate they could not determine. In recent years, there have been attempts to use new technology and forensic techniques to shed light on the case. Advances in DNA analysis, for instance, have made it possible to extract useful genetic information from increasingly small and degraded samples. If there was any biological evidence collected during the investigation that wasn't fully analyzed at the time, or if the original analysis was inconclusive, modern techniques might be able to extract additional information. However, without a body or a clear crime scene, the amount of potentially relevant biological evidence is limited. Geographic profiling and advanced mapping techniques have also been applied to the case. These methods use sophisticated computer modeling to analyze where a body might have been hidden based on various factors including terrain, vegetation, accessibility, and the probable movements and capabilities of the people involved. By creating detailed maps of the area around Timber Creek Campground and modeling different scenarios, investigators hope to identify high-probability areas that might warrant additional searching. Some targeted searches based on this analysis were conducted in the years following the initial massive search effort, but they yielded no results. The use of ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies was explored as a way to search for buried remains without having to physically excavate large areas. These technologies can detect disturbances in the soil that might indicate a burial site, though they require relatively specific target areas to be practical, and can produce false positives from natural geological features or animal activity. Some areas around the campground were surveyed with these technologies, but again no significant findings resulted. Drone technology has advanced significantly since 2015 and newer, more sophisticated drones with better cameras and longer flight times have been used in some of the later search efforts. Drones can cover large areas relatively quickly and can access terrain that is difficult for ground searchers to reach. They can be equipped with thermal imaging cameras that might detect temperature differences associated with decomposition, or with regular cameras that can take high-resolution images for later detailed analysis. While drones have proven useful in some search and rescue operations, in the Deorr Kunz case, they added to the tools available, but did not produce the breakthrough that was needed. The question of whether to conduct additional large-scale searches has been debated over the years. Each search operation is expensive, resource-intensive, and emotionally taxing for everyone involved. Without new information pointing to a specific area, conducting another broad search of the wilderness around Timber Creek seems unlikely to be more successful than the extensive searches that have already been done. However, family members and some advocates have continued to push for more searching, arguing that Deorr Jr. deserves every effort to be found, and that giving up on physical searches means giving up on him. The emotional landscape for those touched by the case has evolved over time. The raw, acute grief of the immediate aftermath has, for some, given way to a different kind of chronic sorrow, a permanent hole in their lives where Deorr Jr. should be. for his extended family members who believe in his parents' innocence. There is the ongoing pain of not knowing what happened to their beloved child or grandchild, combined with the distress of seeing family members accused and vilified. For those who believe the parents are guilty, there is the anguish of suspecting that someone in their family harmed a child, and the frustration that justice has not been served. The impact on siblings or future children of Jessica and Dior Sr. is another dimension of the tragedy. If either parent has had other children since Dior Jr.'s disappearance, those children grow up in the shadow of this case, aware that their parent is suspected of terrible things. The scrutiny from Child Protective Services would undoubtedly be intense, and the social stigma would affect the children, even if they personally had nothing to do with what happened. The question of whether someone suspected of harming or covering up the death of one child should be allowed to parent other children is complex and fraught, balancing the rights of individuals against the paramount importance of child safety. Legal experts have continued to watch the case with interest, as it presents unusual challenges from a prosecutorial standpoint. The absence of a body in a homicide prosecution is rare but not unheard of, and there have been successful prosecutions in such cases. However, those successful cases typically had other strong evidence: confessions, eyewitnesses, forensic evidence of a crime scene even without the body, or other compelling proof that a crime occurred. The Dior Kunz case lacks these elements, making it an exceptionally difficult case to prosecute, even if authorities are convinced they know what happened. The legal doctrine of corpus delicti requires the prosecution to prove that a crime actually occurred before someone can be convicted of that crime. Traditionally, this was interpreted to mean that in a murder case, you needed to prove the victim was actually dead, which typically required a body. Modern interpretations have relaxed this somewhat, allowing for circumstantial proof of death, but the standard remains high. In Dior Jr.'s case, proving that he is dead and that his death was the result of a crime rather than an accident or misadventure is challenging without physical evidence. The statute of limitations is not a concern in this case, as there is no statute of limitations for murder. This means that even decades from now, if sufficient evidence emerged, charges could still be filed. This open-ended timeline is both a source of hope and a source of ongoing stress. For those seeking justice for Dior Jr., it means it's never too late for the truth to come out and for accountability to be achieved. For those under suspicion, it means they can never truly move on, never know if one day they will face arrest and trial for events from years ago. The possibility of a grand jury indictment has been pursued multiple times over the years. Grand juries hear evidence in secret and can issue indictments if they find probable cause that a crime was committed and that specific individuals committed it. The advantage of the grand jury process is that it allows prosecutors to present their case without the defense having an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses or challenge evidence at that stage. However, grand juries that have heard evidence in the Dior Kunz case have apparently not returned indictments, suggesting either that the evidence presented was not sufficient to establish probable cause, or that prosecutors chose not to seek indictments after presenting the evidence. The role of immunity deals and the possibility of someone turning state's evidence has been a subject of speculation. If multiple people were involved in covering up what happened to Dior Jr., it's possible that one could be offered immunity or a reduced charge in exchange for testimony against the others. This is a common prosecutorial strategy in complex cases involving multiple defendants. However, there has been no public indication that such deals have been offered or accepted in this case. If Isaac Rangwin knows more than he has said, for instance, he might be a candidate for such a deal, but there has been no suggestion that this avenue has been pursued. The question of plea bargaining is also relevant. If charges were eventually filed, it's possible that a defendant might agree to plead guilty to a lesser charge, such as manslaughter or child endangerment resulting in death, in exchange for avoiding a trial and a potential murder conviction. Such a plea deal might be attractive to both sides. Prosecution would get a conviction and at least some accountability, while the defendant would avoid the risk of a much longer sentence if convicted at trial. However, plea negotiations typically require to provide information about what actually happened, and if Jessica and Dior Sr. maintain their innocence and insist they don't know what happened to their son, plea bargaining becomes difficult. The civil liability aspects of the case are another dimension that has received less public attention but could be significant. Even without criminal charges, it's possible for civil lawsuits to be filed seeking damages for Dior Jr.'s death. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, requiring only a preponderance of evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. A successful civil case could result in financial judgments against those found responsible, though such judgments are often difficult to collect if the defendants lack significant assets. More importantly, a civil trial would provide a forum for evidence to be presented and examined, potentially bringing out information that has remained hidden. The emotional and psychological toll on investigators, particularly those who work the case most intensively, should not be underestimated. Law enforcement officers are trained professionals who deal with difficult and disturbing cases as part of their job, but there are some cases that get under your skin, that you can't let go of even when you're off duty. The Dior Kunz case has been described by several investigators as one of those cases. The image of a little boy with blonde hair and a bright smile. Gone without a trace, the frustration of believing you know what happened, but being unable to prove it, the pressure from the public and media to solve the case. All of these factors combine to create significant stress for those working the investigation. Some investigators have spoken about the difficulty of facing Dior Jr.'s extended family members, particularly those who believe in the parents' innocence, and having to explain why the investigation is focusing on Jessica and Dior Sr. rather than other possibilities. These family members desperately want to believe that their loved ones are innocent, that there must be some other explanation for what happened. Having to present evidence and reasoning that points toward the parents being responsible is emotionally difficult for investigators, even when they are convinced they are right. The impact of the case on the community of Leadore and the surrounding area has been lasting. This small Idaho community became of national attention for a time, with media crews, investigators, and volunteers flooding into the area. The economic impact of all this activity was not insignificant for local businesses, though it came in the context of a tragedy. More importantly, the case became part of the community's identity in a way that residents never wanted. When people outside Idaho hear about Leadore now, they often associate it first with the disappearance of Dior Kunz Jr., rather than with the natural beauty and recreational opportunities that the area offers. For the tourism industry in the region, the case presented a challenge. Timber Creek Campground and the surrounding wilderness are beautiful places that attract visitors, but some people became reluctant to camp there or visit the area because of its association with the tragedy. Others, with a morbid curiosity, specifically sought out the location to see where the disappearance occurred. The campground itself has been the site of memorial tributes on anniversaries of the disappearance, with people leaving flowers, toys, and messages for Dior Jr. These tributes, while well-intentioned, serve as constant reminders of the tragedy for anyone visiting the area. The psychological impact on other young parents in the area and across the country who followed the case has been significant. The Dior Kunz disappearance sparked countless discussions among parents about supervision, about the dangers present even in seemingly safe environments, and about the unthinkable question of what one would do if their child simply vanished. Parent support groups and online forums saw increased activity from anxious parents seeking reassurance and sharing their own fears about child safety. Some parents became more vigilant, perhaps overly so, keeping their children closer and being more fearful of letting them out of sight even briefly. The case has been featured in numerous true crime television programs, podcast series, and online video content. Each new treatment of the case brings it back into public consciousness and introduces it to new audiences. Some of these presentations have been well researched and balanced, presenting multiple perspectives and acknowledging the limitations of what is actually known. Others have been more sensational, presenting theories as facts and making definitive claims about guilt or innocence that go beyond what the evidence actually supports. The family members on all sides of the case have had mixed reactions to this media coverage, sometimes appreciating the continued attention but often feeling that the coverage is exploitative or inaccurate. The ethical questions surrounding true crime content have become more prominent in recent years, and the Dior Kunz case illustrates some of these issues. When does legitimate public interest in a case cross over into gaulish entertainment? How should content creators balance the desire to tell compelling stories with respect for the real people involved? What responsibility do creators have to verify information and present it accurately rather than simply repeating the most sensational theories? These questions don't have easy answers, but they are important to consider, especially in cases like this where the people involved are still alive and still affected by ongoing public discussion of the case. The financial pressures on Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. as a result of the investigation and public suspicion have been severe. Legal fees for dealing with the investigation, even without being formally charged, can be substantial. The difficulty in finding and keeping employment when you are publicly suspected of murdering your child is obvious. Both have likely struggled financially in the years since Dior Jr.'s disappearance, adding economic stress to all the other pressures they face. Some might view this as appropriate consequences if they are guilty, while others see it as unfair punishment without a conviction for those they believe are innocent. The question of whether Jessica and Dior Sr. could receive a fair trial at this point, given the extensive media coverage and public discussion of the case, is a serious legal concern. Any competent defense attorney would argue that the prejudicial publicity has made it impossible for their client to receive a fair trial before an impartial jury. Jury selection would be extremely difficult, as finding people who haven't already formed opinions about the case would be challenging. A change of venue. Moving the trial to a different location where the case received less attention might be necessary but could be difficult given the national scope of the media coverage. The role of expert witnesses in any potential trial would be crucial. Both sides would likely bring in experts to testify about various aspects of the case. The prosecution might use experts in child development to testify about how far a 2-year-old could reasonably be expected to travel on their own. Cadaver dog handlers to explain the significance of their dog's alerts. Forensic specialists to discuss any physical evidence, and statement analysis experts to explain why they believe the parents were being deceptive. The defense would bring in their own experts to challenge these testimonies, offering alternative interpretations of the evidence and explanations for the parents' behavior. The battle of expert witnesses can be one of the most important aspects of a trial, as juries often give significant weight to expert testimony. However, expert witnesses can also be problematic, as they are hired by one side or the other and may consciously or unconsciously present information in a way that favors their client. The reliability and credibility of expert testimony, particularly in areas like statement analysis and behavioral interpretation, where there is more subjective judgment involved, can be effectively challenged by skilled attorneys. The possibility of a wrongful death civil suit being filed by Dior Jr.'s extended family members against Jessica and Dior Sr. has been discussed, but apparently has not occurred. Such a lawsuit would seek financial damages for Dior Jr.'s death, and could proceed even without criminal charges being filed. The civil litigation process would involve discovery, where both sides could demand documents, depose witnesses, and gather evidence. This process might uncover information that has not been made public through the criminal investigation. However, civil litigation is also expensive and emotionally draining, and without a clear path to recovering damages, family members may have decided not to pursue this option. The impact of the case on policy and practice in child protective services and law enforcement is another aspect worth considering. Have there been changes in how missing children cases are handled as a result of lessons learned from the Dior Kunz investigation? Are there new protocols for preserving potential crime scenes while conducting urgent searches? Has training for investigators been updated to better handle cases where the missing child's caretakers may be responsible? While it's difficult to directly attribute specific policy changes to this one case, it has certainly contributed to ongoing discussions about best practices in these difficult situations. The role of the media in missing children cases is always delicate. On one hand, media coverage can be essential in generating tips and keeping public pressure on investigators to solve the case. On the other hand, excessive or irresponsible coverage can interfere with investigations, prejudice potential trials, and cause additional trauma to families. The Dior Kunz case has seen both helpful and harmful media coverage. Early coverage that spread Dior Jr.'s image widely might have been crucial if he had been abducted and was being held somewhere. Later coverage that focused intensively on the parents' suspected guilt may have made it harder for the investigation to proceed and could complicate any future prosecution. The phenomenon of online amateur detectives and armchair investigators has grown significantly in the internet age, and the Dior Kunz case has attracted considerable attention from this community. People with no formal training in investigation, but with abundant time and internet access, have devoted countless hours to analyzing every aspect of the case, creating timelines, maps, and theories. Some of this amateur investigation has been thoughtful and potentially useful, identifying inconsistencies or asking questions that professional investigators might also ask. Much of it, however, has been speculative and potentially harmful, making accusations without evidence and harassing people connected to the case. The years continue to pass and Dior Kunz Jr. remains missing. His case sits among the thousands of unsolved disappearances that haunt law enforcement databases and the hearts of those left behind. The little boy who vanished from Timber Creek Campground on that July day in 2015 would be older now, a child approaching adolescence if he were still alive. But the likelihood of that grows dimmer with each passing season, each winter that blankets the Idaho wilderness with snow, each spring that brings renewal to everything except the hope of finding him. The investigation remains technically active, the file still open, though the daily intensity has long since faded. Investigators continue to hope for the break that will finally solve the case. Perhaps a confession born of guilt that has become too heavy to carry. Perhaps the discovery of remains by someone exploring the vast wilderness. Perhaps a deathbed revelation from someone who knows the truth. Until that break comes, if it ever does, the case exists in suspended animation, neither closed nor progressing. Jessica Mitchell and Dior Kunz Sr. continue their lives under the permanent shadow of suspicion. They have never been formally charged, never had their day in court to defend themselves, never been convicted of any crime related to their son's disappearance. Yet they carry the weight of public accusation, the knowledge that many people they are responsible for a terrible crime. Whether that belief is justified, or whether they are innocent victims of a rush to judgment, may never be definitively determined without the kind of evidence that has proven elusive. For Dior Jr.'s extended family, the pain endures. Grandparents who should be watching him grow up instead mark the anniversaries of his disappearance with grief and frustration. Aunts and uncles who should be spoiling him with birthday presents instead wonder what really happened to him, and whether they will ever know the truth. The family has been fractured by the case, divided between those who believe different versions of events, unable to find common ground or common comfort in their shared loss. The Timber Creek Campground still stands in the Idaho wilderness, still beautiful, still isolated, still marked by the tragedy that occurred there. Visitors occasionally come specifically because of the case, leaving small tributes or simply wanting to see the place where Dior Jr. was last seen. The campground has become a pilgrimage site of sorts for those touched by the case, a physical location where they can connect with a tragedy they know only through news reports and online discussions. The question that haunts everyone who has followed this case is simple and impossible. What happened to Dior Kunz Jr.? Was he the victim of a tragic accident, his small body hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness where searchers have not yet found it? Was he the victim of something more sinister, his death covered up by those who should have protected him? Did he wander away in an innocent moment of exploration, meeting a fate too terrible for his family to bear? Or is there some other explanation, something no one has yet considered? The truth, whatever it is, remains hidden. Dior Jr.'s story has no ending, only an absence where resolution should be. The little boy with blonde hair and a bright smile exists now only in photographs and memories, in the hearts of those who loved him, and in the conscience of anyone who knows what really happened on that July day. Until the wilderness yields its secrets or someone breaks their silence, Dior Kunz Jr.'s disappearance will remain one of those cases that refuses to let go, that demands answers that may never come, that reminds us how fragile life is and how quickly everything can change. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.